Welcome all to the third of three webinars hosted by Boston University's Advisory Committee on Socially Responsible Investing, otherwise known as the ACSRI. I'm Oliver Poor, a junior in the College of Communication and a committee member of the ACSRI. We are hosting a series of forums on climate change and fossil fuel divestment. The student members of the ACSRI, Jessica Zhang, Brianne McFarland, and I will be hosting conversations with students on both the Charles River and medical campuses later this month. Boston University's Board of Trustees established the Advisory Committee on Socially Responsible Investing to respond to faculty and student concerns about investment holdings. This body researches and reviews relevant investment practices and can make recommendations to the Board of Trustees. The ACSRI is currently studying climate change and fossil fuel divestment in order to advise the board, which will be reviewing, as planned, its 2016 decision about investment in fossil fuels. Through the forums, the committees will be updated about current energy policy, investment strategies, and climate change in order to develop their recommendations to be offered later this spring. The audience is invited to submit questions throughout the entire event using the Q&A function. We will be recording this webinar and posting it to the ACSRI website. Today's forum is titled Urban Heat: Rising Temperatures and Population Vulnerability in Cities. Our three panelists are Lucy Hutyra, Patricia Fabian, and Katharine Lusk. Lucy Hutyra is a professor of Earth and Environment in the College of Arts and Sciences and serves as an associate director of BU Urban, an NSF-funded doctoral program in urban bioscience and environmental health. She also co-directs the Urban Climate Initiative, which oversees the campus climate lab to advance sustainability practices at BU. Patricia Fabian is an associate professor of environmental health in the School of Public Health and co-leads the Sea Heat Project, examining heat vulnerability and exposure in Chelsea and East Boston. She's also a project lead with the CRESSH, the Center for Research on Environmental and Social Stressors in Housing across the life course. Katharine Lusk is the co-director and founding executive director of Initiative on Cities, which spearheads research on cities and mayors and connects urban leaders with BU faculty and students to achieve just, sustainable, and inclusive urban transformation. She previously served as an advisor to the late mayor of Boston, Tom Menino. Katharine will also be serving as our Q&A moderator today. And now I turn the program over to Lucy, as we are extremely excited to have you all, and we look forward to hearing from our panelists. Lucy, the floor is yours.
Excellent. Thank you so much for convening this discussion and inviting me to participate. This is an important issue, and the impacts of urban heat are being felt today in Boston and in cities around the world. I will focus my remarks today on the physical phenomena of urban heat, and my colleague Patricia Fabian will focus on the health, vulnerability, and equity aspects. I wanted to start today by looking at the patterns of change in climate and warming across the globe. The impacts are uneven. Warming is concentrated in northern boreal regions and in parts of Europe, and the patterns of changing precipitation and extreme heat follow different geographic patterns yet. Some areas will experience benefits associated with warming, such as extended agricultural growing seasons, and other areas of the globe will experience cascading challenges related to heat and flooding. Changes within a given region are also uneven. Cities concentrate people and heat. The impacts of warming temperature are felt most acutely in cities. Shown on the screen are two maps. The map on the left is from the Landsat satellite and shows the temperature at the Earth's surface. Where and how we build our cities impacts the distribution of heat. You can see the barren runways of Logan Airport and the downtown core are the darkest, indicating the highest temperatures. The map on the right shows the distribution of tree canopy cover. It is almost a perfect inverse of the temperature map. The patterns of development and building materials give rise to urban heat islands, where in the most built up parts of the city are the warmest. I'll explain the biology and physics of this relationship in a few minutes, but I wanted to point out that some of these patterns are most acute during heat waves. Shown here is work by my colleague, Professor Dan Lee, evaluating the mean differences between urban areas, shown in the red bars, and blue is our rural areas. During background normal conditions, cities are about 1.7 degrees Celsius or 3 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than the countryside that surrounds them. During heat waves, the difference is approximately double to 3 degrees Celsius or almost 5.5 degrees Fahrenheit. So during the hottest times of year, the impacts are even larger and are worst in cities. If we couple these urban heat islands and heat wave impacts with background climate warming, the situation becomes even more extreme. This is an interesting interactive map product that shows how urban climates are expected to change by mid-century for a given city. Here, I've shown Boston. The mean climate of Boston is expected to look more like Washington, D.C. by mid-century. This means more humid summers, warmer winters, and very large changes in snow cover. My 8-year-old son just wrote a letter to President Biden this week, asking him to address climate change because he's finally a good skier and he doesn't want all the snow to go away. This map would be a disappointment to him and his skiing prospects. I wanted to highlight one specific example of how these heat impacts and vulnerability can come together in dangerous ways. This is a map of the area around France and the temperature anomaly in 2003. The anomaly indicates the difference in the temperature relative to the average summer conditions. In 2003, Europe was hit by the most extreme heat wave since 1540. This area usually has mild summers and most people do not have air conditioning. Heat is the top cause of weather-related death in the US and globally. This heat wave in 2003 included temperatures over 104 degrees for 8 consecutive days. The combination of the heat island and heat wave impacts exacerbates heat-related risks, particularly in areas with poor air quality. This single heat wave caused fires, enormous agricultural losses, and the death of 30,000 people. In France alone, nearly 15,000 people died from this heat wave. And those deaths were primarily among the elderly without air conditioning. Cities are concentrating people and heat. Both are projected to increase in the future with further warming temperatures and urban growth. By mid-century, it is expected that 2/3 of the world's population will live in cities. So, how do we tackle this urban heat problem? Well, first and foremost, we need to go to the root cause. We need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Because of the lifetime of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, we have already locked in substantial warming, but we can still limit the extent. Second, there's a role for air conditioning to help us adapt to heat. But as both Patricia and I will discuss, this solution is quite complicated. Third, we can use green infrastructure to help cool our cities. This image that's shown here is a rendering of Commonwealth Avenue and what it could look like in the future, implementing many of the elements of the climate action plan that the trustees implemented a few years ago. And green infrastructure in the form of green roofs, green walls, and an expansion in tree canopy is part of the solution. Fourth, we can build smarter, which is also rendered in this image. With cooler, materials can be used that are cooler, that have higher reflectivity and lower absorption of heat. Finally, we can use the very low-tech solution of shade. So I will discuss several of these solutions and how they might play out in cities. Warming climates mean increased electricity demand. The figure that I'm showing here is from my colleague, Professor Ian Soo Wing, and it shows the relationship between temperature and electricity demand. Peter Foxpenner also discussed related issues, but the current projections across the continental United States are that there will be a 1.7% increase in electricity consumption associated with temperatures. But within this relatively small average are big changes locally. The blue in this graph shows the current relationship between temperature and US energy consumption. When temperatures are mild, down here, the consumption is lowest. The red and orange in this graphic shows what temperatures are likely to look like, what energy use and the relationship with temperature is likely to look like by mid-century. Electricity demand will be redistributed from northern regions to southern regions of the country, and from cold times of the year that are driven by heating to the summertime when it's driven by cooling needs. In New England, we're anticipating a 17% increase in peak energy demand, but that's likely an underestimate because that does not take into account the major push that is underway to electrify everything. And that will also mean an increased use of air conditioners. This image that's shown on the right is from India. They are dealing with their increased urban heat through air conditioning. I'm not sure I want to see Boston relying on solutions like this. There are lots of questions and challenges before us with electricity supply and demand, particularly surrounding transmission adequacy. Recent problems in both Texas and California have really highlighted these challenges. There's a web of increasingly costly and complicated constraints under our normal operating conditions for the electric grid. There are other options to cool cities: trees. First off, trees provide shade. They reduce the amount of radiation that reaches the ground or maybe goes through your window to heat your house. Now, if you think back to some of the biology that you may have learned when you were here at BU, you may recall that plants photosynthesize by taking in carbon dioxide and using energy from the sun to make carbohydrates. Trees open small pores on their leaves to take up the CO2, and in the process, they lose water. That water goes from a liquid form in the ground through the trees, and then as it enters the atmosphere, it changes from a liquid to a gas. And that process consumes heat, thereby cooling the area surrounding the tree. In fact, trees can cool very substantially. A 20% increase in tree canopy cover can cool local temperatures by 5 degrees Fahrenheit. But the challenge in cities is to find the space for trees. Our cities currently include relatively few trees and lots of other surfaces, like buildings and roads. The energy that comes in from the sun must balance between several different reservoirs, several different places it could go. The energy can be used to evaporate water, as I described, or it can warm the air, as shown in this purple portion of the arrow, or it can warm the ground. And surfaces like black asphalt in our roads are very effective at trapping heat. And in cities, much more of the incoming energy from the sun goes to heating the air and heating the surfaces, compared to in more rural areas, more of it goes to evaporating water. This allocation of heat means that the relative differences in temperature are largest at night, as the materials that comprise the city release the heat that they stored up during the day, and the trees don't help us with cooling since there's no sunlight. But the absolute temperature differences are largest during the daytime. In these images, it shows patterns and how they evolve across both the day and across the city in Boston. And this is work that was done in collaboration with Professor Dan Lee and Mark Friedel and led by former PhD student John Wang. This graphic on the right is work that was led by my former PhD student Andrew Trelicia, highlighting the intersection that makes something of a perfect storm in our cities. Each of these dots is a town in Massachusetts. And if we look across Massachusetts, the cities that have the lowest tree canopy cover also have lower albedo, meaning they're darker, absorb more of that incoming heat. These cities have the highest population density, as indicated by the size of these dots, and they have the highest temperatures. But I'll note that Boston is not the hottest city. Chelsea and Somerville are hotter based on how intensively those cities are developed. Those cities also have particular concentrations of vulnerable populations. So will we continue to receive these cooling benefits from trees? This map is showing Boston, and it's showing where we currently receive most of the cooling from trees. This shows where the trees are located and what they're doing. And my student Ian Smith has been spearheading this work. Like much of what I've shown you, this is uneven across the city. The areas with the highest supply of cooling are not necessarily the areas with the highest need for cooling. Further, this cooling may not continue. We can imagine a scenario where temperatures continue to increase. If temperatures continue to increase, it's possible that that evaporation and that cooling that I described from trees will continue or even increase, increasing the local cooling with the increasing temperatures. This will result in a reduced dependence on air conditioning to deal with the extra heat and an overall reduction in urban air temperatures. On the other hand, rising temperatures may cause trees to close their pores because it's just too hot. That will reduce the cooling from trees, increase the dependence on air conditioning, and the production of waste heat that gets released back into the urban environment, increasing urban temperatures and making the problem worse. This was led by my postdoc, Joy Winborn. The story that I've shared so far about trees has assumed that they have enough water. In the arid West, places like Phoenix and Los Angeles, the trees all need to be irrigated to survive, competing with households and agriculture for water. The benefits that I've described that are helping make cities like Boston livable may not last in the future. So if I go back to this slide, which shows how we can tackle this urban problem, I think it's clear that there's no magic bullet. We need to do all of these solutions. But having devoted my career to understanding greenhouse gases, it is clear to me that reducing fossil fuel emissions is first and foremost in solving this problem. My presentation has focused on the science of urban heat. But at this point, I want to pass it over to my colleague, Patricia Fabian from the School of Public Health, who will discuss issues of health impacts, vulnerability, and equity.
Thank you, Lucy. Thank you, and thank you everybody for attending. It's a pleasure to be here. So as we've heard, as the world gets hotter and heat waves become more frequent, we are learning much about how heat impacts health. So I'm going to share with you why we care about heat and who is most impacted, particularly in cities. Here's a list of some health outcomes associated with heat exposure, and I'll be explaining them more in the next slides. Most of you are familiar with the work linking heat and mortality, and we heard from Professor Hutyra about the European heat wave in 2003, which killed over 30,000 people. You may also have read about the heat wave in Chicago, which killed over 700 people. What may be less known is that most of the people who died were low income, Black, and/or seniors. This graph is work from Professor Greg Wallenius, and it shows how with an increasing heat index, which is a combination of temperature and relative humidity, there's a higher risk of death this is in a study in New England. This is work also from Professor Wallenius's group looking at a national database of insured people in the US, showing that, as you would expect, with increasing summer temperatures, there's an increase in emergency room visits related to heat illness. That's the graph on the left. So things like dehydration and electrolyte imbalance and just heat illness. But in the second graph, you'll see that there's also increasing rates of emergency department visits due to renal disease. Chronic kidney disease, or CKD, is one example of renal disease where your kidneys are damaged and they can't filter blood the way that they should. In the US, there's around 37 million adults living with CKD, and risk factors include diabetes, high blood pressure, smoking, and it disproportionately affects Black people, people of low income, and with lack of access to healthcare. In other parts of the world, such as Central America, we are seeing an epidemic of CKD, not in older adults, but in young men with high occupational exposure to heat. This is a focus of Professor Scammell's work with sugarcane workers, construction workers, and brick makers in Nicaragua and Salvador. Her work is showing that a combination of factors, including intense physical exertion and high heat, along with dehydration, are linked to the high rates of CKD, with climate change contributing to the increasing CKD epidemic. High temperatures impact pregnancy because heat makes babies arrive early. This is work by Dr. Janowitz that has shown that for every 10-degree increase in temperature, there is a higher risk of a baby being born too early. Now, this is her doctoral student, Lindsay Butler's work. And this relationship changes depending on where you live. So you can see that if you live in the West, the risk is higher than if you live in the Northeast. There are disparities in preterm birth rates since they are 52% higher for Black compared to white women. And this translates into disparities in infant mortality since 2/3 of deaths occur in preterm babies. So non-Hispanic Black infants die more than twice as often as non-Hispanic white infants. Another outcome affected by heat is the risk of miscarriage, which is the death of an embryo or fetus before the 20th week of pregnancy. This is Professor Westling's work showing that the risk of miscarriage increases with increasing temperature. And my last example is about how heat impacts learning. When classrooms are hot, it is hard for kids to focus, hard for them to process and memorize information. This is Professor Goodman's work in the School of Education that showed recently a study across the United States that the more hot days students were in school, the lower their math and reading scores. So other studies have shown that heat stress impacts Black and Hispanic students 3 times more than white students. And these impacts aren't just in kids, because there are other studies showing how worker productivity decreases with increasing heat. One thing to note is that given the increase in frequency, intensity, and geographic distribution of extreme climate events, scientists, including Professor Pat Kinney, are now studying the synergistic health impacts of compound climate events. So for example, what happens in a community if there's a hurricane followed by a heat wave, or if there's a wildfire followed by a drought. I've already touched on the fact that heat-related health impacts affect certain populations unequally. So in our CRESH Environmental Health Disparities Center, we study heat vulnerability in Massachusetts by trying to identify areas where vulnerable populations might live. So people might be vulnerable to heat because of sociodemographic characteristics, for example, being Black or Hispanic, not speaking English, which means they don't find out about heat wave warnings or learn about available cooling resources. Environmental characteristics that contribute to vulnerability might be living in neighborhoods that have very little green space, as we heard from Lucy, or living in older housing, which is poorly insulated and doesn't have air conditioning. Finally, older adults are vulnerable to heat because they can't thermoregulate as efficiently. And if additionally they live alone, they may be socially isolated, which means having less people checking up on them during a heat wave or helping them get to a cooling center. So we combine all these vulnerabilities and use it to identify areas where cities or community organizations can intervene. And here's an example of the heat vulnerability index in Massachusetts. All the colored areas have a higher vulnerability index. The blue areas are vulnerable because there are a lot of older adults living there. So you can see here it's Western Massachusetts and Cape Cod. And in the green and purple areas, vulnerability is related to older housing, sociodemographic characteristics such as being Black or being Hispanic. And you can see that that mainly centers in Boston and other urban areas. We're using a lot of these tools to support building capacity to respond to extreme heat events as part of our Sea Heat project in Chelsea and in East Boston, shown here on the map. So as you can see, all the neighborhoods are classified as environmental justice, which means more than 25% minority, more than 25% English language isolation, or having low household income. This is a Massachusetts definition. So we've partnered with Green Roots, a climate justice community organization, and are now informing heat resilience planning in both cities. The data maps we're generating can help residents, community organizations, and city government make decisions to build heat resilience and interventions. For example, this temperature map labeled urban heat islands identify areas in the city that get the hottest. And we heard about urban heat islands from Lucy. The reason these urban heat islands exist is because there's a lot of sidewalks, streets, and building surfaces made out of things like asphalt or concrete that absorb and hold heat. We can identify which houses and buildings have air conditioning. So here in the map, the blue rectangles show buildings with central AC, and the pink don't have central AC. So this could support campaigns to purchase and pay for operating air conditioning. This third map we created in response to a request from our community advisory board, who wanted to know where rubber roofs, which are the green rectangles or figures there, in the city were located that could potentially be converted to white roofs with reflective paint or green roofs like the one in the picture. And this last map shows in detail what the green space distribution is in the city. So we can identify parks where people spend their time in the summer and find places to increase spray features or hydration stations. And as we heard from Lucy, green space cools, so we can look for areas with little or no green space. So Lucy and I have been working on a project that bring our fields together, and this slide shows you recent work by my postdoc, Kuntiskens, where we compare where there's a demand for cooling. That's the City of Boston map on the left, which combines information to highlight areas where there's urban heat islands, where a lot of people live, and where a lot of vulnerable people live. So we overlay that with the map of cooling supply of green space in Boston, which is mainly coming from trees, and then identify neighborhoods where there are mismatches. So zooming in on one of these neighborhoods, this is in Boston, close to Chinatown, you can see that there's two areas of high demand for cooling, mainly driven because there's some affordable housing complexes there, some of them for older adults only. So if you compare that to the green map on the one site, you can see that Castle Square actually has green space and Oak Terrace does not. And you can see that in the photos as well. So this tool can be expanded to any city really in the world if we have the data, and use it to kind of find places where you can intervene at a finer scale. A related tool was built by a doctoral student in our urban program, Raquel Jimenez, for Speak for the Trees, an organization whose mission it is to improve tree canopy equity. So anybody can go to this website and explore their neighborhood and then use the data to advocate for more equitable tree plantings. Back to Sea Heat, in Chelsea and Dorchester, we are still learning from residents about whether they have and use air conditioning, what they know about staying hydrated, what is their social capital and connectivity, are they energy secure, meaning do they have to choose between paying for rent or food versus electric bills, and do they find out and act on heat wave warnings? We're measuring temperatures in the summer. Outdoors, you can see all these sensors that we've hung up on trees. And then we're also measuring temperatures indoors, inside their homes, and then personal exposure to understand how hot the temperature gets indoors on a hot day, whether it impacts their sleep, whether it changes their physical activity, and other things. And finally, we're listening to learn things a community cares about that we haven't thought to ask. This is work from another doctoral student, Layla Haydari, in a project called Speak About Heat, with older adults in Boston who took pictures and shared their actual lived experience over 2 summers ago. So this participant reported that they used a fan on the first floor to stay cool and an air conditioner on the second floor because of safety concerns. Another thing she learned was that older adults might own window air conditioning units, but physically might have a hard time installing them. They're really heavy. So she worked with city staff at Age Friendly Boston from the city of Boston. And now there's a buddy program to help seniors install and take down window AC units each summer. So I'll now turn it over to Katharine Lusk to talk about what mayors are thinking on climate change and heat.
There we go. Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure. Bear with me while I get my screen up so you can see my slides. And there we are. Great. So you've heard a little bit about, or I should hopefully you've heard a lot about the science of climate change and urban heat. And you've also certainly heard about a range of the consequences of it and a range of the health impacts. And I want to close by offering a few slides and a few remarks about some of the work we do at the Initiative on Cities, specifically related to mayoral leadership and local leadership around climate issues. And I'll start by just saying you've probably seen the headlines. There have been no shortage of them about climate leadership at the local level. So the top one, cities may be our greatest hope in the face of climate change and the pandemic, is actually an article written by Anne Hidalgo, the mayor of Paris, and Bill Peduto, the mayor of Pittsburgh. You may have also seen the news about Mayor Walsh. Walsh promises to continue bold climate action as new chair of National Climate Mayors Group. Mayor Walsh actually, before he's about to depart us here in Boston, he actually took the helm of a major climate network of mayors from across the country. And what I want to share with you is that, all of these headlines are not just sort of media attention. They actually are an indication of real momentum and real political will to tackle climate change at the local level. And I'll start with a little timeline from some research we've done around city level climate networks, because I think it's really illuminating in terms of how much recent momentum there has been around local climate action. And I'll start by saying, in 1990, we had the formation of an organization called ICLE, actually founded by a mayor, to bring together over 1,500 cities and towns across the country to work toward a sustainable future. So not yet talking about climate change, adaptation, and mitigation, but really centering on sustainability. Fast forward to 2005, and we had the mayor of London convene the C40, a global coalition of the world's leading climate cities, alongside the COP UN meeting. And he did this because of the feeling among mayors that they weren't being taken seriously as government and as stakeholders in the climate planning process. Fast forward even further, and you see between 2013 and today, a range of climate networks that have actually emerged, both here in the US and around the world. And it's been remarkable to see the maturation of this field as organizations like Climate Mayors come together with nearly 500 mayors across the country, pledging to amplify their voices and advocate for federal level policy to address climate change. And then even more sort of niche organizations like the Carbon Neutral Cities Alliance, which are a subset of cities that are really trying to take aggressive action. And I mentioned the CNCA, as they're called, because they just launched a multi-million-dollar fund to advance really aggressive and innovative climate action at the local level, including things like carbon neutral neighborhood districts, carbon budgeting in the municipal budgeting process, and circular economy cities like we're starting to see in places like Amsterdam. And I had the pleasure of joining Graham Wilson, our faculty director, at the meeting you see here on the lower left, which is the last meeting the C40 was able to hold in person in Copenhagen. And there was this sense at that meeting that they were finally being taken seriously on the world stage. And here you see an address by the Secretary General of that group. I also wanted to touch on one of the reasons there's so much political will to address climate action at the local level. This is research that we've conducted out of the Initiative on Cities. It's a multi-year project we've been leading with Katie Einstein, Max Palmer, and David Glick, dubbed the Menino Survey of Mayors. So every summer we have the pleasure of doing live interviews with over 100 mayors across the country, and we survey them on a whole range of really critical issues. And here you see their responses to a question about whether they believe that climate change is due to human activity. And indeed, 84% actually believe in the science and they understand the science. And this actually puts them ahead of the general US public. The same question has been posed by Gallup many times over the years to the American public. And here we find that across the country it's actually holding pretty steady, interestingly, about 68% of the American public believes climate change is due to human activity. So mayors are in fact out in front of the rest of the public on this issue. Now, we've also asked them, are they willing to put money on the table to address climate? And the truth is that yes, actually 70% of mayors agree that they support financial investment and fiscal sacrifice to address climate change in their community. And we've actually asked this question of them over time, and we found that their support has held incredibly steady, if not increased, between 2014, 2017, and 2019. We're probably due to ask this again this summer. And I'm going to close here really with where we started, which is a discussion of urban heat. This is not our survey. This is a different survey from a different unit, and it's a survey of both mayors and other city officials, again, from across the country. And they were actually asked the extent to which they have observed changes to their local climate in the last 5 years. And what you see here is that overwhelmingly, leaders across the country at the local level have observed an increased frequency and intensity in flooding, in heat, and in drought. Indeed, 62% of them are observing more frequent and longer heat waves just in the last 5 years. And I wanted to close here just to make a fine point of the fact that there is this need for sort of action and advocacy among America's mayors is really being driven by necessity. And I think Patricia and Lucy offered some really fine insight into this, into the reality that is playing out at the local level. The experiences of residents are changing. The reality that mayors are actually facing every year, every summer certainly, is changing. And in order to maintain the livability of their city and to maintain the health and well-being of their residents, they really feel a new sense of urgency, more so than they even have in the past, to take action. I'm going to stop my screen share, and we are going to pivot to questions. And so I'm wondering, Lucy and Patricia, would you both please turn your videos on and your audio? I'm going to make sure your audio is on, so we're not unmuting. And I see a number of questions have come in, but I'm gonna have moderators' prerogative. I'm gonna ask the first question. Because you both referenced student work multiple times in your presentations. And there has been so much new infrastructure built at BU, just even in the last 7 years since I've been here, to really support student level research and work in partnership with communities. And I'm wondering, Lucy, in particular, if you could touch a little bit about, share a little bit with this group about the BU Urban Doctoral Program and potentially the Campus Climate Lab. And maybe Patricia, you can offer a little bit more insight into some of the work that someone like Layla Hutyra or one of the other students have been undertaking. And then I promise I will get to as many questions as we can.
Great. So my colleagues, Pamela Templer from the Biology Department and John Levy from the Department of Environmental Health, and I have been leading a program that's supported by the National Science Foundation called Urban. And what we've been doing through this program, and it came out of student demand. Students wanted to have more experiential opportunities to not just talk about climate change, but work with communities to try to address it and see how science made its way from the ivory tower and publications that might be read by a disappointingly small number of people to actual policy and improve the quality of life in the city that they live in. So Pamela and John and I, along with many other faculty across all of BU, we wrote and were funded by the National Science Foundation to create this program. It's now in its 4th year, I believe, and we have a couple more years to go and will hopefully extend long beyond that. And it gives students a chance to do their science, but do it in a way where they're thinking about the basic science of things like what I discussed about the physics of heat, but also the human health impacts of how that change, how that's actually felt, and work with cities and NGOs to take that science into practice to improve the livability of our communities. And this has really come, like I said, from student demand. And that's true at the undergraduate level, that's true at the master's level and at the PhD level. They don't just want to talk about the problems of climate change. We've been talking about it for decades. They want to do something.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And Patricia, is there an example you can share from some of the work your
Yeah,
own students have been doing?
I agree. The urban program has given great opportunity to students to get involved, whether it's government, community organizations. I had a couple examples in my presentation. Raquel, who did the Speak for the Trees project, kind of to think about where you could plant trees with a lens to equity. Leila Haydari is another student, also kind of presented the heat vulnerability. And another student of mine, Kate Connolly, is doing something a little bit different, looking at indoor air quality in schools, and then how that could be linked, for example, the high levels of CO2. So taking kind of all the exhaled breath that is in classrooms, and then instead of just putting that into the atmosphere, thinking about how we could recycle that into a rooftop garden. So she and Sarah Beth have shown that if you put plants sort of at the exhaust port of a building, those plants grow faster and larger than plants that are not there, so that they're uptaking that CO2. Whether that has sort of implications in how much carbon they can sequester, I'm not sure, but it's certainly sort of a good merging of, say, thinking about health, reducing CO2 in classrooms, which would help students focus and learn better, and then sort of capturing that into supporting growth of rooftop gardens.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So I'm going to pivot. I'm going to start taking some questions from all of you, and a reminder to please use the Q&A function to submit your questions. First, a very brief comment, which is someone asked if this is being recorded. It is being recorded and it will be available online. So first question, Lucy, I think this one is for you. Are there certain trees that are more effective in continuing the cooling and transpiration, even in the greater heat scenarios?
Great question, and I wish I had a really concrete answer. That we're working on that question. My colleague Pamela Templer in biology and I have a number of student projects where we're looking at exactly that. And it's still in progress, but what I can say definitively is that trees in cities don't behave quite like trees in the countryside. They do more. And one of the projects that we're looking at now related to water, because in order for trees to do the services that they're doing, they need to have water. And there's the question of where do they get their water and will they have water in the future? Mm-hmm. And honestly, it's a little bit gross, maybe, but trees tap sewers and they're getting fertilized by sewers, and trying to think about how these trade-offs come together. And some of the trees that cool the most, that means they're using the most water. So they may be doing the most ecosystem service by cooling our cities today, but they may not last tomorrow as the temperatures get higher if they run out of water. So this is a very open area for research. So I don't have a black and white plant tree X and your problems will be solved. It really needs to be a tree that can actually survive in that location. It also has to be a tree that's the right size for a location, because not all trees fit in all places.
Mm-hmm. And this is related to some of the work that the students were doing, right? Of the work around the right tree in the right place here in Boston.
Yep.
Someone else asked, this is a related question for either of you. In addition to green walls and high reflectivity surfaces, could architectural changes like increased use of covered or underground structures contribute meaningfully to heat mitigation? And you both touched on this a little bit, but I'm wondering if either of you wants to share anything else about it. Green wall, efficacy of green walls and high reflectivity surfaces.
I think there's a lot of solutions. I don't think there's one solution, and the solution for a place like Boston may not be the solution for a place like Dallas. We're seeing different kinds of solutions and some unintended consequences play out in different places. I'll give an example from Germany. In Germany, they use district heat. So below ground, there's heat that's redistributed across the city. And they've found that with warming, groundwater is warming. And so things that they never really even thought about are changing the efficiency of some of the infrastructure. Those sorts of infrastructure changes that we're not anticipating. There will be so many of these that will come. And I think that moving some things underground and changing where shadows are, thinking about things like where the shade is relative to where you plant the trees, thinking about the colors of the roofs, thinking about, you know, solar panels, where should they go, where should they not go, and some of the trade-offs associated with solar panels, because solar panels and trees do not necessarily thrive in the exact same location. So I think there's a lot in terms of the environmental and civil engineering, but also just about having communities that are livable, that people want to live in.
So just to build a little bit on that, I also think we need to have a systems sort of approach to it, because I do know, for example, in countries that are states, right, like Arizona, where there's lots of desert, putting shade is a good way for kids to be able to go outside and play, etc. So that sort of solves a local problem of heat exposure, and that, okay, now kids can go outside and it's shaded, but it doesn't solve kind of the overall problem of having an urban heat island, because you've just put an impervious surface on top. So it provides shade, but it doesn't do anything for the overall urban heat island necessarily. So I think there's solutions like, well, put a green roof on top of that, or put reflective surface, but I just would sort of caution that we need to be thinking in the systems way to actually make it a solution, you know, sort of not just for the local immediate problem.
Well, and then there's all of the health benefits derived from green spaces and public spaces as well, right? That for in terms of mental health and physical activity, and so there's the livability element that's also really critical. There's the need to cool the city, and then there's also the need to beautify the city in a way that actually has a meaningful impact on quality of life for people. Yeah. Are there any technologies in development that seek to capture surface heat and store or convert it to more useful purposes? Are either of you aware of anything?
So I cheated and Googled this question because I think it's a really
You're looking ahead.
and it came in early.
Yeah.
And I think that there are technologies like that underway, but nothing is in large scale deployment. Most of the technologies that are sort of at this interface that are further along and are actually being deployed have to do with the color of roof surfaces, including some technologies where the color of the roof surface can change from white to black, depending on if it's winter and you want to absorb more heat, so you use less power to warm the inside of a building versus cooling in the summer. But I think there is an array of technology that's in the pipeline, and we need more.
Someone asked the question whether there's anything we can learn from cities in tropical or desert regions with respect to controlling urban temperatures. And I'm curious, I know from even just from the C40 meeting that there were a number of mayors there from African cities who were sharing, and from the Middle East actually, who were sharing examples of how they were contending with urban heat, including trying to increase shade, so man-made structures that provide shade, and even just things that we think of as being part of sort of a beautiful city of fountains to try to find other ways to cool the air, which is not necessarily sustainable from a water, sort of water reclamation, water use perspective. I know also Melbourne has massive cisterns that it's building underneath its parks in an effort to actually conserve rainwater and flooding and use that to then water trees when they are in periods of drought. Those are a few that I'm aware of, but there are other examples that you guys know of from your own work of some of the ways that cities in really arid regions are actually trying to contend with urban heat.
So as part of the Sea Heat project, one of the sort of sub-projects there was to do this extensive literature review. What other cities doing, right? What have they done to kind of combat heat? And it's actually up on the Sea Heat website if anyone's interested, looking sort of a map across the US. And then we're sort of expanding to the world, but it's sort of a combination of things around painting roofs white, right? Making them reflective, so increasing albedo. Things like adding spray parks that only get turned on in the summer, right? What was I going to say? For not necessarily for urban heat island, but for subsidizing air conditioning for people who can't afford it. There's actually surprisingly little literature on how well those interventions work on health. So there's sort of a lot of ideas. There's lots of gray literature of sort of things people have tried, but it's like a really opportunity for research in that what actually works And I will just also say that the community is so important. So what works in one community and in one desert area may actually not work in a different community, even if it's the similar desert area. So sort of really important to kind of make listening to the community part of whatever strategy anybody wants to implement.
Lucy, there's a question here saying, apropos involving students in developing climate solutions, which we do know we do. So I'm going to ask you about that. Has the university ever held or considered an innovation challenge event or competition to encourage practical implementation and maturation into commercial products? I'm wondering if you can use that as an opportunity to talk about the Campus Climate Lab, and then also even the relationship with, Innovative EU and other resources.
So I am lucky enough to wear a few different hats related to sustainability at the campus. And another one, which wasn't in the bio, is that Dennis Carlberg and I lead the Campus Climate Lab. And what we're trying to do with that is take action on campus that addresses climate change. So how do we take basic research or whether it's from our faculty and students or elsewhere and implement it into the operations of the university? We run 3 times a year a competition to support students or faculty to implement solutions on campus. That's us leading by example. This started 1 year ago, almost exactly. We put out our first solicitation right as COVID hit. Timing was poor. And so we're finishing up our first year of projects. In May will be our next deadline, I believe May, maybe late April. Come back to me on that. And 3 times a year we run this. So that is an innovation challenge for the students and faculty to implement solutions. There's also, from a commercial products, and this is a little bit outside my expertise, and I might let Katharine add to this, but there's Innovate at BU, and there's a lot of, and through the BU Sustainability Office itself, there's a number of seed grants and initiatives that take student ideas and commercialize them and help the students, take ideas to fruition.
Yeah. So as Lucy mentioned, I'm a judge for the Campus Climate Lab, and I've been a judge for the sustainability seed grants that are a partnership between Sustainability at BU and Innovate at BU. And it's really, I'll just tell you, it's really incredible to see the creativity and innovation of our student body. If there are students tuned in, thank you for your ideas and your creativity. And I think part of Innovative BU, and I think what we hope to see more of, and I think the university hopes to see more of in the future, is that the ideas that are seeded through the Sustainability Seed Grant and through the Campus Climate Lab actually work their way into the Innovative BU pipeline, where there are opportunities for student initiated ideas and companies and products to actually get the support they need and get seed funding and other things that they need to actually fully commercialize and launch and develop a business plan. And so that's what's exciting, is to see all of these ideas sort of take shape and the resources that exist to spark them, and then the support that's in place to actually help them grow. I see here, I have a question. Oh, go ahead, Lucy.
I was just going to add, one thing that's been really fun about the Campus Climate Lab is it's a completely different idea, where it's supporting research, but every single project we partner with the operations arm of the university, so that it's not just basic research. I shouldn't say just basic research, but the research is designed for implementation. And we're leading by example. One of the first projects that we did with this used BU's greenspace as an example to think about, where do we have plantings and trees and mulch and grass, and what do our landscaping choices translate into? And we published that to be an example to other universities and other large landholders to think about their greenhouse gas budget and their climate actions holistically, not just about electricity use, but about all the other things that influence greenhouse gases. And I'll stop there.
So I have a question about whether there's correlations between mayoral acknowledgement of humans' role in climate change and size or location of the cities. And I should know that off the top of my head, but I don't remember We do cross tabs every time we get mayoral responses to a different range of things. And I don't remember if there's a relationship between climate change and size or location. I don't believe there is. We tend to get mayors, honestly, across the country, and north, south, middle of the country, that really understand the science and understand the need to take action. And part of that really is that they are seeing this play out and they're seeing it impact the lives of their residents in real ways right now. And so there is this this fundamental drive and momentum behind the need to take action. I wanted to close. We have about 5 minutes left, and I want to give you guys an opportunity to say you've been doing this work for a while, and I wanted to give you an opportunity to say if there's anything. I know you keep learning new things, but is there work you're learning about urban heat that is new news to you? Is there anything that you knew that you've seen that you didn't know before that really has struck you as a reason for either a greater sense of urgency or a new opportunity, some new insight that is something that we can really be acting on now? I know my answer, so I can answer last, but I'll let you both go.
That's okay. So I've been at BU for 11 and a half years, apparently. And when I first started, I didn't actually think that trees in cities mattered. I thought they were lovely to look at, but from a greenhouse gas perspective, I thought there weren't enough of them to possibly matter. And I was wrong. And it has spurred a whole line of research to understand how many different ways I was wrong and why was I wrong. And that has been incredibly exciting. And it's led to new biological insight about why are the trees in cities behaving differently, and also modeling and thinking about future climate change and will it last. So science is about testing hypotheses, and my hypothesis was wrong. And it's been fun learning what that means.
Patricia?
I think one thing that has really struck me is that how siloed everybody is and kind of what they're studying, and that if you really want to create change and make a solution, you have to bring everyone to the table. And the sea heat study is a good example, sort of working with consultants, city officials, community organizations, residents, and then all the scientists, right, and everything that we're creating. And I think that has been I think when you're a scientist, you sort of generate information and you think it's going to get used, and you've sort of found, great data. And I think I've just been amazed every time at how much more we have to do, and not just scientists, but also from the funding, because funding drives, we're interested in this narrow slice of science, right? We're not interested in community engagement, or we're not interested in research translation. So I think that to me has been sort of keeps getting hammered sort of as something that needs to change about how we build projects, how we fund projects, so that science can actually get transferred into action.
Mm-hmm. And I see one question here from David Jernigan, so I'll let him have the final question. And Patricia, you both may know this. Are there specific city policies that are exemplary in dealing with urban heat? Patricia, is there something you guys have seen? I know you've been looking at city level climate action plans related to urban heat mitigation. I mean, the one comment I'll make to you, David, is Boston just issued an RFP and is in the process of developing its own resiliency plan related to urban heat. So some cities, like northern cities, this is a newer issue that they really are trying to tackle that they haven't necessarily either been aware of or had to contend with until now. But both of you go. Are there exemplary city policies?
Nothing comes to mind. I feel like cities are working on it. I feel like there's plenty of cities, and Chelsea is a great example, I think, of that. But I'd have to think about whether something that has already resulted in good resilience planning.
I wish I had a nice example to point to, and I don't. The best example I can think of is one that's very, very fresh in thinking about a development project in Boston, which ended up being put on hold, and the entire process is restarting now. in thinking about heat. And it really touches on many of the ideas that Patricia and I both discussed, of thinking about where are the people, where is the need, and how can we reconfigure where bus stops are so that people aren't standing, breathing exhaust in the blazing sun? Where do we put canopy so that it will have a larger impact on housing that maybe the people that live there can't afford to turn on air conditioning, even if they had air conditioning? And that sort of thinking about what the built environment looks like, what mobility looks like, and what green space looks like. Unfortunately, I don't think that, using Patricia's language, that sort of systems thinking of trying to integrate these different kind of core elements of a city, it's only just at its infancy. We have a long way to go.
Mm-hmm. So I'll close by saying, and then I'll turn it back over to Oliver, but my comment and my observation during my time at BU is, number one, how much talent we have and how many folks we have trying to answer some of those questions that David just posed, which is what will really work. And I think the comment you both made, which is working across academic silos. So knowing Josh Goodman presenting to folks in environmental health and biology and earth and environment, and the desire to share knowledge within our own community, and then the desire of our faculty and student community to say it's not enough to observe the problem, we actually have to solve it. And I think I see that and hear that all the time in the grants we get, in the grants we're reviewing, in the climate action plan, and so many other steps. And so thank you both. I really, really appreciate it. Thank you so much to the ACSRI for hosting us today. And Oliver, we will turn our videos off and turn it back over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. On behalf of the ACSRI, I would like to thank our three guests, Katharine Lusk, Lucy Hutyra, and Patricia Fabian, for sharing their insights with us today. And thank you to you, our audience, for all of your questions. This webinar recording will be posted to the ACSRI website. For students in the audience, please watch for an announcement about the student conversations we'll be hosting on both the Charles River and medical campuses later this month about climate change and fossil fuel divestment. Thanks again for joining us, and have a good evening.